Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this year's Kenneth P. Thompson Lecture on Race and Criminal Justice Reform. My name is Jason Williamson. I am the Executive Director of the Center on Race, Inequality, and the Law here at NYU Law School. Our center is proud to co-sponsor this event with the Peter L. Zimroth Center on the Administration of Criminal Law. Thank you to all of our partners at the Zimroth Center for all of their work in helping to put this event together. We are incredibly excited to hear from our distinguished panelists here tonight as we discuss the unique challenges facing Black women prosecutors across the country, particularly those who have committed to attempting to reform many of the harmful and long-standing policies and practices adopted not only by their offices in years past, but by prosecutors' offices around the country. But before we jump into our conversation, I just have a few housekeeping issues that I want to make sure we cover. First of all, there will be CLE credit available for this event. At some point during the course of the next hour, I will provide everyone with the applicable CLE code, and anyone seeking CLE credit will need that code in order to complete the attorney affirmation form that will be circulated following the event. So keep your ears out for that. Also, we are determined to set aside at least a few minutes for Q&A toward the end of our time together, and have already gathered some audience questions through the registration site. But since we only have an hour, the Q&A is likely to be fairly limited, but we'll do our very best to get to your questions either directly or in the context of the larger discussion. This event is being recorded and will be available for viewing on the law school's YouTube channel within the next few weeks. So if you have to leave early, or if there are friends or colleagues that are going to miss the live event tonight, please make sure to let them know that they'll be able to see it probably within the next 3 weeks. Now, before introducing our panelists, I want to turn the floor over to Ms. LaShawn Thompson, who is the widow of NYU Law alum Ken Thompson, for whom this event is named. We are so grateful to LaShawn for her continued efforts to advance the important work that Ken began during his tenure as Brooklyn District Attorney from 2013 until his untimely passing in 2016. LaShawn, thank you so much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Jason. Good evening, everyone. I want to thank you all for supporting the 4th annual Kenneth P. Thompson Lecture on Race and Criminal Justice Reform. This makes the 2nd year in a row that we've done this event virtually. And as I said last year, I look forward to the day when we can all meet in person again. This event is especially important and meaningful to me because it represents the exact work to which Kenny devoted his life. Criminal justice and prison reform was the foundation of his career in public service. As such, it was a no-brainer for me to partner with NYU School of Law to establish this symposium and related fund. Kenny was a proud NYU School of Law alum, and I know he would be so pleased to see how this event has prospered over the years. The timing of this year's event during March resonates with me for several reasons. Kenny's birthday is in March 14th to be exact, and this is also colorectal cancer month, a disease that Kenny bravely fought until the very end. And finally, March is Women's History Month, and this year's panelists are all strong representations of women's empowerment. They are all dynamic and phenomenal, and I cannot wait to hear from them. Given our current political, cultural, and racial landscape, it is even more critical that we continue these conversations to effect systemic change in our world. On behalf of my family, we are humbled at the great show of support, and I thank everyone who played a role in pulling off this program. Enjoy the program. Back to you, Jason.
Thanks so much, LaShawn. Really appreciate it. I am Really excited to hear from our panelists. I'm going to do some quick introductions for all three of them. I want to acknowledge, though, that there's much more to say about what they've all accomplished in their lives, and I invite you to look them up if there are things that or other things that you want to learn about the work that they've done. And I also hope that they will have an opportunity to speak to a lot of that work over the course of our conversation. Kimberly M. Foxx is the first African-American woman to lead the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, the second largest prosecutor's office in the country. Kim took office on December 1, 2016, with the vision of transforming the Cook County State's Attorney's Office into a fairer, more forward-thinking agency focused on rebuilding public trust, promoting transparency, and being proactive in making all communities safe. She was elected to a second term in 2020. Kim served as an assistant state's attorney for 12 years and was also a guardian ad litem, where she worked as an attorney advocating for children, navigating the child welfare system. Prior to being elected state's attorney, Kim served as chief of staff for the Cook County Board President, where she was the lead architect of the county's criminal justice reform agenda to address racial disparities in the criminal and juvenile justice systems. Born and raised in Cabrini Green on Chicago's near North Side, Kim is a graduate of Southern Illinois University, where she earned a BA in political science and a JD from SIU School of Law. Thank you so much, Kim, for joining us. On February 10th, 2015, Stephanie Morales became the first woman to be elected Commonwealth Attorney for the city of Portsmouth, Virginia, and is the chief law enforcement officer for her city. Stephanie was re-elected in November of 2017. Upon taking office, she immediately created sustainable programming aimed at reforming the criminal justice system in Portsmouth. These efforts include establishing the Stephanie N. Morales Future Leaders Initiative, through which her office has hosted over 100 youth as junior Commonwealth attorneys over the past 2 years. Stephanie also formed the Control-Alt-Delete program to help restore felon rights and reduce recidivism. And through these programs and others, she strives to advocate daily for those who cannot fight for themselves, including working to address our mental health crisis in the criminal justice system and to disrupt implicit bias in prosecution. She works daily to ensure the community is engaged with her office and constantly informed about what is happening in the justice system. Stephanie earned her Bachelor's of Arts degree at Norfolk State University, graduating magna cum laude. After obtaining her BA, she went on to attend the College of William and Mary School of Law, where she obtained her JD. Most importantly, she is a fierce advocate for justice and a wife and mother of 4 children. She is proud of the work for the community, she's proud to work for the community where she was born and raised as a true public servant. Thank you, Stephanie, for being with us tonight. And finally, Angela J. Davis, Distinguished Professor of Law at American University, Washington College of Law, is an expert in criminal law and procedure with a specific focus on prosecutorial power and racism in the criminal justice system. Professor Davis previously served as director of the DC Public Defender Service, where she began as a staff attorney representing indigent juveniles and adults. She also served as executive director of the National Rainbow Coalition and as a former law clerk to the Honorable Theodore R. Newman, the former chief judge of the DC Court of Appeals. Professor Davis is the author of many publications, including Arbitrary Justice, The Power of the American Prosecutor, published in 2007, for which she won the Pauline Rule Moore Award in 2009. She's also the editor of Policing the Black Man, Arrest, Prosecution, and Imprisonment, published in 2017. In addition to her prolific scholarship, Professor Davis is also a member of the American Law Institute and the Council on Criminal Justice. She's a member of the Board of Trustees of the Frederick Douglass Jordan Scholarship Board and the Board of Directors of the Sentencing Project. Professor Davis was a reporter for the ABA Justice Kennedy Commission and a member of the ABA Commission for Effective Criminal Sanctions. And importantly, Professor Davis also served as a member of the advisory board for the Vera Institute of Justice's Prosecution and Racial Justice Program. Professor Davis received her BA from Howard University and her JD from Harvard School of Law. So that was a mouthful, and that was a condensed version of all of the many accomplishments our guests have been involved in over the course of their careers. Thank you again to all of you for joining us. There are a lot of policy issues and things that we could jump into, and to the extent that that is appropriate, I want us to do this. But I really want the focus of this conversation to be about your experiences as Black women, and particularly as Black women doing this work and studying this work. It is not lost on me that for the last 2 days, Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson has been subjected to all sorts of questioning about her record and her qualifications to serve as the next Justice of the United States Supreme Court. And so this is a timely conversation, I think, and one I'm really excited to jump into. I want to start, this question I think is for both Kim and Stephanie. I want to hear a little bit about at what point in your journey, whether that was in law school, prior to law school, once you graduated, at what point in that journey did you decide that you wanted to become a prosecutor, and why? And to what extent, if at all, was that decision tied to your identity as a woman of color? So, Kim, do you want to start, and then we'll move to Stephanie from there.
Sure, thank you. I'm so honored and thrilled to be here to this event. And so let me just get out the way that it means so much to do this in Ken Thompson's name. When I was elected back in 2016, the morning after my election, Ken Thompson called me and said, "Sis, I'm glad you're here. We have work to do." And unfortunately, he passed before I won my general election, but I have a big picture of him in my office as a reminder of the work that we promised that we would do in New York and Chicago, and how formidable that would be. And he would be so proud of how big the tent is. He would be so proud to see the work that my sister Stephanie Morales is doing, and the rest of our sisters across the country are doing. I don't know that he could have even fathomed this. So it is an honor to be here today, and an honor to be here this week as we watch this historic nomination to the Supreme Court, and watch really for the world to see what Stephanie and I are going to tell you about what it means to lead as Black women in this field, and what that landscape looks like. When I decided to be an assistant state's attorney, an assistant prosecutor, it came after I was serving on behalf of children in the foster care system, and watching kids who very much had the same background that I had. I grew up in public housing. I grew up a child of a teenage mother who had substance use issues, who had mental health issues, and did everything she could to make sure my brother and I were well cared for, were loved. While she struggled with her issues, she was a phenomenal mother. And so working in the foster care system, where you saw so many young children come into care whose lives were being blown up, and decisions about what would happen to them were being made by prosecutors who had no connection to these communities, to these issues, who fresh out of law school had, were making determinations about whether to terminate a parent's right from their child, creating legal orphans, and really making assumptions about Black communities that were not based in reality. A lot of them were watching shows like The Wire and thinking that they were going to be prosecutors, to be, the good guys in the white hats, and all the while leaving a wake of destruction because decisions weren't being made that were in the best interest of our communities. And so I decided, after 3 years of being a public guardian, that I wanted to work in the state's attorney's office specifically on these issues of child welfare, to have the power to say no. I didn't want the power to do great things. I wanted the power to pull back. I wanted the power to be able to say that, we are actually causing harm in some of the things that we are doing, particularly to Black communities. Everything that I've done in my career has been rooted in my identity. And I have made no secret about that. Because when I walk into a room, I'm not fooling anybody. I think that they can see that I am Black. I think that they can assume that I am a woman. And, I also am very proud. I'm a project chick. I come from the projects. And there are assumptions that are made about people who live in low-income housing. There are assumptions that are made about people who live in communities that are impacted by violence. And I'm here to disrupt all of those assumptions, because I think our system has been allowed to run rampant in communities like that because they don't see our hope and potential. And so when people are surprised by how articulate I am, or the fact that I'm a lawyer, and I tell them that I'm foremost proud of being from Cabrini, it is to set the stage for my policies, and my agenda are set to make sure that every kid from every neighborhood like mine has the opportunity to be a prosecutor, a Supreme Court justice, a teacher, a social worker, that their lives matter. And I wear that loud and proud.
Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate that, Kim. And Stephanie, I'll let you jump in. It is not a coincidence, I think, that both of you are now working in the cities where you were born and raised, which is amazing, and I'm sure adds to your commitment to the work. But let me not put words in your mouth. Go ahead.
So thank you guys for having me. I too am honored to be here with my sisters who, make me proud and who I stand in lockstep with as we do this very difficult work. I don't know where that bio came from, but I think it's probably about 5 years old. So now I've been elected for 7 years. I'm in my third term. And I have, really had the experience of finding out just how flexible I am, because I never was interested in being a prosecutor at all. I was not interested in criminal law, and I definitely was not interested in being elected, because I am probably about the worst politician there is, because I literally say and do what I want all the time. So when I went to law school, I have 4 children now, but when I started law school, I was 22 years old. I had a 5-month-old and a 1.5-year-old son who are now 16 and 17. And I commuted from Portsmouth to William and Mary every day. And I literally said, my 1L summer, I'm taking the first job in Portsmouth, Virginia. I don't care where it is, but I'm not commuting. And that offer was at the Commonwealth Attorney's Office, where I now serve as the head Commonwealth attorney. What I immediately noticed was that a lot of my friends, a lot of my classmates were coming through the system. There were comments being made. There were decisions being made that were impacting families, that were changing the dynamic of our community. I immediately had a shift in my thought process. It immediately became not just important, but it became a part of the fabric of my being that I make a change, and that I decide to, step up myself and be an assistant Commonwealth attorney. I had no idea that, a couple years into being an assistant Commonwealth attorney, at 31 years old, I was going to end up becoming the Commonwealth attorney, because my predecessor would become a judge, and I had a decision to make about who I wanted in the role of Commonwealth attorney in my city. And as you know about Black women, sometimes when a job has to be done, we're the ones who step up and do it, regardless of whether it's personally what we think we want or need. And so since 2015, I have redefined what being a prosecutor means. I have redefined what the face of a prosecutor's office looks like. And I've tried to do that constantly while engaging with the community, while having the community in my office, while being in prisons, while being in classrooms, and having, what we're seeing happen now, diversity, not just in our office in terms of race, but professional diversity. I now have in my office 5 attorneys who used to be public defenders, and having these conscious decisions that really impact the lives of the people in my community on a consistent basis. So I was never interested in doing this type of work, but once I stepped foot into the criminal courtroom and saw what was happening to members of my community, it really became important to me. And I get asked the question all the time, and I'm sure, Kim does as well. How does it feel to be a Black woman doing this job? And it's heavy. It is difficult because we're talking about incarceration, and we know that Black communities and marginalized people have been over incarcerated and lives and communities destroyed. But my response truly is that if you are not unnerved, if you are not disgusted, if you don't see a problem with this the same way that we do as Black women and Black people, you're not fit to serve as an elected prosecutor. And I really don't care what your background is, because now we're at a time in our country where we truly need people who understand that we are not becoming safer as a result of mass incarceration. We're harming our communities. So, I take this work very seriously as a Black woman, yes, but I think we need different leaders now who are looking at the data and who are understanding just what this system has done and the work that we have to do to reverse course.
Thank you so much for that. There's a lot in there, Stephanie. And Angela, I have a couple of related questions for you, and I'm going to get there in a second, but I can't resist asking one follow-up for both Stephanie and Kim, just to give it some thought. As you know, there are other schools of thought about, what one should do when they leave law school if one wants to, affect change. And I'm curious whether either or both of you received a lot or a little pushback or kind of backlash about your decision to do this work, particularly as a Black woman. I imagine, I would hope that there were many people who supported your decision, but I'm curious whether there were others who, and I'm talking mainly about other people of color and other folks who are concerned about these issues, who raised questions with you about your career decision and how you dealt with that.
Yeah, there's backlash now. I mean, just to be clear, we do this work very differently. And I think we're not quiet about it in terms of, when we're given the opportunity, we discuss the work that we do. But for the most part, we're in the trenches doing the work. And so we don't have opportunities every day to talk about the work that we do. And sometimes because of the harm that has been done to members of the community, they look at prosecutors and they think that prosecutors are aligned with the system that is there to destroy them. And so, yes, I have a lot of people in my community who are very supportive. They vote, they encourage. And it was the same way when I was deciding to go into this profession. A lot of people knew I would do great things, but the reality is that our profession has been such a problem and people have been harmed so greatly that there is still pushback, there is still negativity, and there is still hesitance. And I take every opportunity I can to apologize for what this profession has done so that people understand we're acknowledging the harms that have been done as we try to move forward. But it's important to say it's not just, when I was an assistant that people were, concerned. They are still concerned just because of the sheer nature of what our profession has done.
Thanks, Stephanie.
Yeah, I would echo that, but I would also say, even when I was a young assistant, when I saw defendants come in the room, some of them had a look like, do you see me? There's a sense that it might be more fair when you look around a courtroom and you don't see someone who looks like you. And so, there was some initial pushback, but like Stephanie said, I came in saying that I wanted to do it different. I came in saying that it's not a us versus them, because at the end of the day, I'm a them, and sitting over here trying to help us. And the structures and the systems that I've inherited, were created, centuries before I got here. And so I think for a lot of people who have hesitancy, again, we have to prove our legitimacy and credibility. But I would also say that I know, and I've talked to, that defendant's mom who would come in the courtroom and just see my face and ask about the next court date. Or, someone would come and talk to me because they believed that I could see them. And so I would tell any law student who's out there that you can have a tremendous impact, and the absence of us in positions of power seeds that space to where there is nothing that can happen if we are not present. And so it wasn't as much pushback as I had anticipated, again, because I was unapologetic about where I was coming from in this work. And I just have to continually legitimize what we are doing, recognizing that there is a history that comes with it.
I appreciate that. And, you know, to be clear, as both of you have kind of suggested, neither one of you was hiding the ball here, and you were elected. You ran on a reform platform and you were elected by the people, right? So none of this should be a surprise to anyone. We'll get back to that shortly. But Angela, thank you again for being here. I'm really grateful that you can add your perspective here. And I'm curious, as a person who decided to not just kind of dabble in public defense work, but really dig in and do some really important work as a public defender in you know, a more than reputable office that has been doing great work for many years. I'm curious, given your work as a public defender, your experiences, you know, on the other side of the V with prosecutors, if you could talk a little bit about your decision to focus much of your scholarship on the prosecution function and why you still think that's an important piece of the story, including from someone who spent much of their career doing public defense work.
Thank you, Jason, for that question. And thank you for inviting me to be on this panel. You know, whenever I can talk about Black women prosecutors, I jump at the opportunity. But then when I knew I was going to be on a panel with these two women, I couldn't pass up that opportunity. I'm honored always to be with them. Yeah, you know, if you told me 35, 40 years ago that I would be here doing this work now, I wouldn't have believed it. I started out as a public defender. I'm still a public defender, and my heart will always be. I feel like that's the most important work I've ever done or will ever do. But it was that work that really led me to this path. When I was a public defender, I was fascinated in a negative way, like astonished by the power and discretion that prosecutors had, that they could use that power to do whatever they wanted. And most of the prosecutors that I litigated against, that I was in court with, I'll put it this way, many of them abused that power and discretion. And what I mean by that is I saw different people being treated differently who committed the same offense. Some people got favors, some people didn't get favors. There was no rhyme or reason to it. And it was frequently based on race and class, right? The people, you know, the very few white clients, and we didn't have very many in Washington, D.C. at that time, they got favorable treatment. And the poor Black clients, they were treated poorly. And I saw those disparities. And nothing would happen to the prosecutors who would do a lot of this, by the way, it was legal for them to do this. I didn't understand that. But oftentimes they were engaged in all kinds of misconduct. They were never held accountable. And I was just like, I was angry about it, frankly. And so when I became a professor, I had to look into this because I was like, how could this be, right? How could somebody who's, you know, the basis of our democracy, right, is transparency and holding people accountable, you know, who have power, right? That's what democracy is about. When you're granted power, you have to be held accountable, but these prosecutors weren't. So that led me to do the research, that led me to write Arbitrary Justice. And Arbitrary Justice is about all the terrible things that prosecutors do, about how they abuse their power. And it seeks to sort of figure out how we can fix that problem. So how did I get here working with prosecutors? It's because, you know, we've come to the point where, you know, we realize that, hey, if we just get good people, you know, who understand that we have a mass incarceration problem, who understand that we have racial disparities and more racial disparities in the system and that those things are wrong, and who are willing to use their power and discretion to fix those problems, listen, you know, that same power and discretion can be used to do good. And that's exactly what these two women and so many others are doing. I should have known that it was going to be Black women that was going to change my mind about this and make me realize that good could be done. And these women are two phenomenal examples of how prosecutors can use that power to do the right thing, to transform lives. And I couldn't be more proud of both of them and of the other Black women. And there are others who are also doing this tremendous work. So that's kind of what led me here.
Thank you for mentioning that, over the last, I guess, maybe 5 to 7 years or so, there seems to be a bit of a movement developing, particularly among women of color who are interested in trying to turn this thing upside down. You heard Kim and Stephanie talk about the extent to which their identity had a lot to do with why they're doing the work and also their approach to the work and what they think is important. From your vantage point, do you think is it fair to have a greater expectation of people of color or women of color who go into this work versus the majority of white men who are doing the work and who may not approach it from the same perspective or with an eye towards any kinds of reform? As you know, there are, I'm thinking Larry Krasner and others across the country who've been talking about some of the same sorts of reforms, but who've garnered very different responses from the public, at least in part. So I'm just wondering, do you think there's a special responsibility? Is it even fair to impose some sort of special responsibility on women of color or people of color who want to get into the prosecution world? And if a law student decides that they want to go down this road, that they're just interested in doing prosecution work, should we expect them to find ways to change the way the system works, given what all of you have said already about the ways in which the prosecution function has been abused by some in the past?
No, absolutely not. We should not be expecting putting a special burden on Black women. People do that all the time. And no, we need to stop putting burdens on Black and special expectations on Black women to do this or do that. We should have an expectation of every single person who is a prosecutor, especially every prosecutor, but certainly chief prosecutors, to do what the United States Supreme Court said they are supposed to do, which is to do justice. There's a case called United States versus Berger, which says, and I'm paraphrasing, it's not the duty and responsibility of prosecutors to seek convictions, but to seek justice. And part of the problem is that too many prosecutors have done just the opposite. They have sought convictions instead of justice. Sometimes justice does mean locking somebody up, but sometimes justice means letting someone go. Justice, it depends on the case. And so, no, I don't think there's a special responsibility on Black women, but I think that, and let's be clear too, it's not every person who's a Black person or a Black woman, right, is about Black people and is about, not every chief prosecutor who's a Black person or even a Black woman, is about transforming the system and doing justice. It just so happens these two and I would say most of the chief prosecutors of Black women do understand that and do have that duty. But no, I don't think they have a special burden. I think all prosecutors have that responsibility. It just so happens that because of these women's life experiences, and I've worked with a lot of the Black women chief prosecutors, but the ones who have had life experiences that permit them to understand, our communities because they grew up in our communities. They have the empathy that every prosecutor should have for every person who is either a victim of a crime or charged with a crime. They understand their life circumstances, right? And I think part of the problem is so many of these chief prosecutors do not have that experience. They don't care to have that experience. They don't have that empathy. And so therefore they are continuing to do the harm that both Kim and Stephanie talked about. But I think when you have that life experience, when you grew up, having that experience in your life and grew up in communities where you could experience firsthand, either through yourself, through your family members, or just being in the community and understanding it, I think it does give you, that special ability to be able to do justice, just as the Supreme Court says that you should do. And you mentioned law students, and you asked them about law students. I'm a law professor, and I will tell you, I have been teaching for 25 years at the Washington College of Law, and for the last, 5, maybe more years, every single student who comes to me and says they want to be a prosecutor says, but I only want to be a prosecutor if I can be a progressive prosecutor. I only want to be one if I can work for Kim Foxx or Stephanie Morales or Rachel Rollins when she was there, or Dinah Becton. And that's what they're saying to me. And I'd like to think I had something to do with that. I won't deny it, but I'm so proud of that. I debate my fellow colleagues in the academy all the time. Oh, don't be a prosecutor, be a defender. I don't tell my students to be either a defender or a prosecutor. They come to me usually with a feeling of being one or the other. Some say I want to be a defender, and I say yes, and I want to help them be the best defender possible because we need good defenders. But the ones who come to me and say they want to be prosecutors, I say yes, use that power in ways that can transform this system. And let me tell you who you need to try to go work for. So I think we need to encourage both, and that's exactly what I try to do.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate it. Stephanie, can you, and then Kim, I'll come to you with the same question. Can you say a little bit about, and Angela touched on some of the potential advantages of doing this job as a Black woman who can relate in ways that others may not be able to. So you can touch on that as well, but talk to me about any of the kind of day-to-day challenges that you face that you think are, at least in part, about you as a Black woman doing this job, challenges that maybe some of your white counterparts in other parts of the state might not be dealing with on a daily basis.
Yeah, so when you say daily basis, that's really my life. Like everything is a day-to-day fight. There is a literal fight every day for me with my team. I spend, every day, almost all day, working to try to get my prosecutors to see the community members who come through, whether they're victims, whether they're the accused, as their family members, and treat them as they would want their family members treated every single day. And I have a good group of people, but when you are in a system that tries to act as though it is a mill, you have to work against that system. And so literally, I feel like I'm an infiltrator. And my team feels like they're infiltrating because we literally have everybody mad with us. The judges are mad with us because we're, going against the grain. We have public defenders, interestingly, who, like I said, I don't have a big office. So to have 5 former public defenders in my office, that's a large amount. I have these former public defenders who are fighting their colleagues who, because of how fair we are, there is no interest at times in reaching the best outcome or the fair outcome or what we approach with, but forget about these victims. Let's get rid of everything because we can run over them because they must be weak if they're willing to go this far. And so literally, I'm having my prosecutors every single day, having conversations with them about checking their ego, about remembering that this is not about competitiveness or winning, and that to be the bigger people and ignore the other side when they're not being, fair with them, to ignore the judges when they're smacking them down and saying, are y'all even prosecutors anymore? And to work with the community because we do have issues with violence as everyone else does, to make sure that they understand that we are actually prosecuting the violent crime and we're having great success. But it feels like sometimes the challenges are such that we're fighting everyone. There are criticisms that were not made of my predecessor when there were the same issues, 10 years ago when I was an assistant, when he was in the office. But it's terribly rewarding. It is so rewarding because I do see the value in the prosecutors that are in my office. I see how much they care about community. I see how much, the members of my community have faith in the work that we do. I see the young people who have come through the office. I have one young lady who has been a part of my program since she was in college, went to law school, has taken the bar, and is now awaiting her bar results to become an attorney in the office. And so with all these criticisms, with all the struggle and the day-to-day fights, I also see the beauty in the work that we do, the way that we do it. I see how much the members of our community understand how we've been in the trenches with them. And there's trust there. And, when I get people who reach out to me on Instagram and Facebook in any way they can to talk about what they have going on. And, when I see the members of the community and they say, keep up the great work, that's when you feel, yes, it's working. Yes, our community does trust us. But every single day, it's a new challenge. It's not, this job is not easy, but it's certainly not boring. And I've really learned, for young people who are watching this, that it's important too for me to be myself. I put my little line dancing videos on my social media. I put my videos with my kids, with us, dancing, rapping, doing whatever we feel like doing. To also try to show the next generation of leaders, you don't have to be a robot. You can go to work every day. You can engage in this work that's very difficult, that's very taxing, but you also need to remember who you are and who you were before you started doing this work. So every day I also make time to be who I am, whether I'm reading my, science fiction, medieval fantasy books, or whether I'm doing my line dancing classes or hanging out with my kids. Every single day I'm in the trenches doing the work, but I'm also spending some time remembering who I am so that I'm well and I'm whole as I'm trying to do this work.
I really appreciate that. And I just want to say, hand it off to Kim, I really appreciate that last piece, because I'm concerned that, we get into these moments where it becomes, almost fashionable to do certain work and to be, more woke than the next person and this and that. But what happens when that moment passes? And what happens when Stephanie and Kim are no longer doing this work, you move on and you're doing something else, and there's people coming up behind you who need to have a foundation and understand why you were doing the work, not because there was some momentum around it in that particular moment, but because it's the right thing to do, the right approach to the work. So I appreciate that you are trying to pass on some of that ethos to the people in your office who, presumably can pick up the mantle, whether that's in your office or in some other prosecutor's office down the road, right? But Kim, can you say a little bit about just kind of the day-to-day challenges that you've faced, which I'm sure have been legion?
Yeah, of course. And in answering this, I was looking at the questions in the chat box, and I'll spin some of this in here. I think it's not even just that I'm a Black woman, right? And I think if for those of you who've not been paying attention to the Senate Judiciary hearings around Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson, and this woman of impeccable credibility, has worked her way through the federal judiciary, has all of the credentials that one would expect, and watched the attacks that are being lobbed on her to get a real sense of what this looks like, right? And I am not, trying to be seated as a Supreme Court justice, but that's what it looks like. These continual undermining of one's credibility because you are unique to the space. What wasn't said is that Black women prosecutors make up a tiny fraction of prosecutors, elected prosecutors across the country. We're somewhere around 1.5% of all elected prosecutors, of the 2,400 elected prosecutors in the country. There are about 25 Black women who do this work. I am the only Black woman in the state of Illinois who is an elected prosecutor. I'm the only Black person in the entire state of Illinois who's an elected prosecutor out of 102. And so my mere presence is disruptive. And it is something that, again, is we are reckoning with these kind of culture wars around talking about race and racism and institutional racism, that talking about it makes you a target. Merely saying that there are systemic injustices related to the disproportionate impact on Black and Brown communities makes you a target. I think what the differentiating factor between myself and my sisters in this work is that we call it out. And so, one of the things that we did was we put all our data on an open data portal. I wanted the public to see who we were charging, what we were charging them with, what the sentencing outcomes were going to be. And we had it by race, by gender, by zip code. So it's not me saying things, I want you to see it. So when we talk about data, historically, prosecutors were one of the most opaque players in the criminal justice system, the most power and the least visibility in how we used it, the most power and the least transparent. When I put all of our data on the open data portal, it sent shockwaves because we were then able to see how we were using our resources. I'm in the city of Chicago where we have a horrible, unrelenting crisis around gun violence. And we were spending more of our time and energy going after low-level, nonviolent retail theft, shoplifting, than we were going after shootings, than we were going after homicides. And the reality is that the overwhelming majority of our homicide and shooting victims were Black men. And to suggest that we were actively, as an office prior to me coming, working to keep communities safe, our practices were not rooted in safety. What we were doing and how we were using our resources weren't keeping communities safe by needlessly putting people through the system and having them labor with a conviction, for example. We know the collateral consequences of a conviction. And so having someone with a drug conviction impacts their ability to get a job, to get housing, and those things we know lead to an increase in criminal behavior. And so for me, it was like, let's call a thing, that these institutions that we were saying were about safety, particularly safety in Black and brown communities, were not about keeping those communities safe because they were just as dangerous when I was coming up as they are now. And so what we did, what differentiates me from some others who have done this work, is that we've called it out, we've shown it. We have said, let's look at, are we being proportionate? Are we going after violence? And I stopped doing the thing that I see a lot of people do, and I've watched these hearings where people are like, what about the victims? You don't care about the victims. I started telling the truth, that a lot of our defendants who come through our criminal court system have also been victims, that victims and defendants often inhabit the same body, that you might be sitting with them on one side of the room today and on another side the other. And that if we don't address the root causes of that, if we don't figure out how the system has created such conditions, we are playing a shell game. And that's what's happening. And I think we have to encourage our law students to not think, again, good guys, bad guys, white hats, black hats, but systems and the things that research and data and evidence have told us around, criminology, and ask ourselves, are we as prosecutors doing the things that are going to address that? And I think that's what I do. And I think that is what brings me the biggest amount of pushback, is that I do talk about race. I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen, in a city like Chicago, where we are about 30% of our population is Black, about 30% is Latino, 30% white. The fact that 75% of the people in our jails are Black men, the fact that 80% of the people who are homicide victims are Black men, tells me that we have an issue related to race. And the notion of race neutrality laws or race neutrality application is a lie. And because I do that, and because I say I'm not going to spend my resources going after low-level nonviolent offenses that could otherwise be dealt with out of the system, the target on my back becomes a lot more significant. And so to answer your questions, what's the data? The data's out there. The research has been out there. I think what you've seen from the Black women who do this work is that we put it before you. We don't talk in rhetorical talking points. We talk in data, facts, and evidence. And the truth of what that data reveals some really troubling systemic issues that we have to address, and we can't flinch from doing that.
Thank you for that, Kim. Angela, I have a question for you, but before we get there, I want to make sure I announce the CLE code. So everybody listen up, here we go, ready? The code is Thompson 2022. So THOMPSON 2022, Thompson 2022. And I want to go back. You talked earlier about some of the things that we should expect of all prosecutors, irrespective of their background. And I wonder if you could drill down just a little bit, and I know we're running out of time. We are trying to incorporate some of the questions here. But what are some specific things modeled on the way that Kim, Stephanie, and others are doing their work around the country? What are the things, if there are 2 or 3 things that you think prosecutors around the country need to be thinking more about and sort of modeling their work in the same way, what would those things be?
And I'm going to answer your question, I promise, but I have to, I hate people who don't answer the question they ask, but I have to talk about the attacks on Black women prosecutors.
Please.
And why it's so, why it makes my head explode. So I mentioned the Supreme Court before. The Supreme Court has a long line of cases that sanctions the power and discretion of prosecutors, right? That says, separation of powers, we the courts, we can't tell prosecutors what to do. They get to charge who they want. If they don't want to charge, they don't have to charge. It's totally up to prosecutors. Courts can't touch it. No one can touch it, right? And those were cases in which the power of prosecutors was being challenged because they were using their power and discretion in ways that were producing racial disparities. McCleskey versus Kemp comes to mind, a death penalty case. Armstrong versus United States, where prosecutors were charging Black defendants in federal court where they got long time and white defendants. The court says, no, we can't do anything about it. But the minute Black women get that power, oh boy, is there a change, right? And I'm not saying Black women are the only progressive prosecutors are attacked. Absolutely, Larry Krasner has people coming after him, Chesa Boudin now is facing a recall effort. Yes, but the attacks against Black women have been the most vicious, have been racialized, have been sexualized. Kim Foxx had the Proud Boys marching in front of her office saying the most awful things, right? Judges trying to take away her power to do what white prosecutors have been doing for hundreds of years. In cases way more serious, they've been dismissing cases. But as soon as a Black woman does what everybody's been doing for years, they try to take the power away. And if we had time, I could give you hours of examples, but we don't. But that's a point that I think must be made, right? The police officers who tried to subpoena Stephanie to keep her out of a case so that she wouldn't have the power to handle that case. I could give you tons of examples. And it's racialized, right? It's the Black women, Kim Gardner in St. Louis. I could go on and on. Rachel Rollins, when she was the state's attorney, Commonwealth's attorney in Suffolk County, is now U.S. attorney. It's over and over again. It's not a coincidence that they try to take this power away. And so I think that is a point that cannot be made enough. Now, you asked the question, models. Boy, you just heard them talking about. They just gave you some phenomenal examples, right, of the phenomenal work that they are doing. They are examples, as are so many others, right? When they are not asking for cash bail in these cases where people are sitting in jail because of poverty, because they don't have the money to get out, or when people who've done even more serious crimes can pay to get out. So they're opposing cash bail. They are not charging in cases where, people don't need to go to prison. They're diverting cases out of the system. As Kim said, focusing on the more serious cases and cases that are nonviolent cases, diverting them out of the system. They are freeing wrongfully convicted people. Kim had the first mass exoneration in the state of Illinois and did something that prosecutors never do. She apologized for stuff she didn't even do. It wasn't even her. It was her predecessors, but she knows the power of prosecutors, right? And so, all of these are examples, and there are many more, but I know we're short on time. You can go to their websites and see the phenomenal work that they are doing. I also would direct you to a report that was done by Data for Progress. If you just Google Data for Progress, progressive prosecutors, a report will come up with statistics that shows the phenomenal work that these women and other progressive prosecutors are doing, and doing it consistent with public safety, You know, reducing the jail and prison population without an increase in crime, which is a horrible lie that's now being told by people on the right. So, so they're examples. They are great examples, and I invite the audience to go and look at the work that they're doing.
Thanks, Angela. And yeah, I mean, I feel like, you know, we could, if we had 2 more hours, we probably still wouldn't get to all the things and get into the depth that I think all of us would probably like to. But thank you for that. I really, really appreciate it. Stephanie, Kim, I want to give you guys a chance to close us out with any comments or responses to any of the questions that you've seen. We've got a bunch that came through here recently. It looks like some of this is about the CLE stuff. So I'll say one more word about the CLE stuff before we close here in a minute. But anything you want to leave us with, either about the things that you think are most important around what you've accomplished at this point and what still needs to get done, or any message you may have for folks who are thinking about either going into the work or how, and I think this was one of the questions, how to balance the work of a traditional prosecutor, some of which you still have to do as a prosecutor, and this sort of new approach to the work that you're trying to bring. So Stephanie, we can start with you.
Yeah, so that question about how do you balance? Let me first start by calling a thing a thing. It starts off by saying, oh, that's nice that y'all, you know, see about the disproportionality and the disparities, but your job is such and such and such. Well, that's the thing. Our job is to do what we told the members of our community we said we would do when they elected us. And that is to use our power to reshape the way our offices function. And I don't think anyone has heard either one of us say, oh man, we're just done with this whole, you know, prosecution thing. We're not going to prosecute anybody. What we have said is we don't have unlimited resources, and that too many resources are being spent on incarceration, and it's not making us safer. And so we're going to utilize our resources, and we're going to utilize our discretion to stop harming people who are not making our communities unsafe. And we're going to utilize our resources to focus on prosecuting and incarceration when necessary for those people who are committing murder, for those people who are committing rape, for those people who are harming people and are making our communities unsafe. And so that's where I have to be really clear, because our white male counterparts and our white counterparts don't get told, well, you know, as somebody who has not sat in your shoes, I'm gonna tell you what your job is. And so it's great to have an example real time of somebody telling us what our job is. And, it's really important for us to stop coming into spaces and telling people what their responsibility is when we're here telling you the way we do our work and why. And so I want to end with, when you have people stepping into these roles and their communities trust them to do things a certain way, it's important that we respect that and that we understand that, as Professor Davis said, prosecutorial discretion has been around forever. It only became a thing when we decided to use it. And so I want anybody who is interested in prosecution to step into this work and be bold, because there are communities who recognize now and understand the power that prosecutors' offices have, and they are interested in transforming this system. They are interested in being smart about our resources, because we have communities who cannot fund education and who can't fund public health because we're over incarcerating. We realize that we have not utilized our resources in the correct way. So if you walk away with anything else, please understand that all of us have brought our intellect to the table, and we've thought about the way we utilize our resources, including human capital, our prosecutors, and we're doing this in a way to help heal our communities and not harm them.
Thank you, Stephanie. Kim?
I mean, she said it. That's real. At the end of the day, looking at that question, the problem where we have ourselves in the communities that have been most impacted by these systems is that we never asked our predecessors, are you checking your power? As Professor Davis talked about, she saw prosecutors for decades abuse the power of their discretion, and it went unchecked. it absolutely went unchecked. The level of scrutiny that I've gotten as a prosecutor, I don't hide from. I believe in transparency. I wish we had this level of scrutiny when police in Chicago were torturing Black men on the South Side and getting them to wrongfully confess. I wish we had this level of scrutiny that I wouldn't have had to vacate the wrongful convictions of 175 men so far. And that was allowed to exist because the other people who were doing this work were assumed to be credible and doing this work with the highest levels of professionalism and integrity. And that assumption was proven wrong. And I would also say that that assumption was allowed to be okay because, as someone talked about the violence of the 80s and the 90s, there was once a belief that anything goes, and that our Constitution can be put on the shelf out of the spirit of fear. And the communities that were impacted by our fear of them were Black and brown communities like the one that I grew up in, and that somehow people can reconcile bad criminal justice policy because it was happening to those folks over there, and that we didn't realize the generational impacts that we would be living with today. And so what I would say for those of you who've asked these questions, to check the assumptions that you've come to this conversation with, to check the assumptions about whether we've gone too far, what we need to balance, and ask yourselves, by doing a historical perspective of how we got here, where the checks and balances were before. Because like I said, I became a prosecutor so I could have the power to actually say no. And the things that I've said no to, not prosecuting people for marijuana, we've now legalized marijuana. To not prosecute people for driving on suspended licenses because they couldn't afford their tickets, we changed the law. Now you don't suspend people's licenses for that. We've eliminated cash bail here in Illinois starting in 2023 because we realized that too many communities were being impacted, not because they were a threat to safety, but because they were impoverished. So we're changing the laws, we're recognizing the harms of the past, but those harms of the past were allowed to exist because they were happening to communities of color and instituted by people who were not from those communities. And so for me, what I would say to you all, be critical thinkers. That's what the beauty of being a law student is to think critically, but to not just look at where we are in this moment now, but ask ourselves where we were 30 years ago. And as we reckon with violence, as it's re-emerging in our communities, this work and staying steadfast and doing the right things, even when it is not politically expedient, requires a level of bravery that I generally see in Black women who know that the stakes are high and that we cannot afford to wither. And we should be so proud and lucky to have jurists like Ketanji Jackson or Brown Jackson, Stephanie Morales, and the others across the country who are willing to do this work because we were built for this.
You were indeed. And I know we're up on time, but Angela, I know you wanted to add one last thing before we go, please.
And I hate to, because that was so beautiful that needed to be the last word. But I just want to say this. I talked before about how, when these women came in, all of a sudden now, where the court said prosecutors have power, now they want to take the power away because they were using the power to do good, to free people, to make the system more just. But I think there's a really important point that needs to be made. Despite all the attacks, despite the judges trying to take away their power, despite the police unions, despite all the people out there who are trying to take away their power and attack them, guess what? The people re-elected them. The people the people said, I don't care what you say, judge and police union. We like what they did and we want some more. We want 4 more years of that. Stephanie's in her 3rd term. So, democracy, our democracy is truly broken in this country, but guess what? Sometimes it works because it worked here. The people elected them. Kim knows when she gets all those attacks on Twitter, I just say, Kim Foxx, keep doing what the people elected you to do, right? And that's the big point here, is that clearly they're doing the right thing and their constituents know it because they're asking them to continue that work. And I'm so proud of both of them.
Incredible. I'm going to let everybody go. Folks who are attending, be on the lookout for an email with the attorney affirmation form. You just have to fill that out if you want CLE credit and turn it in by Monday the 28th. Thank all of you so much for joining us. I'm so grateful to you, so grateful to Black women in general. Keep up the good work, keep up the fight, and everybody have a great night. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.